All right, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I want to clarify too, this morning Kenny said that y'all traumatized me. I want to let y'all rest assured that there are some pretty faces out there. Not many, but there are some. No, I'm just kidding. So we started a list of sermons running up to Christmas, and today we're going to be talking about there shortly before the birth of and shortly after of Jesus. And I wanted to open this up today with Luke chapter 2, verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Right, so as we study the Word, we understand that God can arrange everything, or will arrange everything to make happen what He wants and make it come to completion. The birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ is no exception to this. Another exception to this is a story we talked about 2 Sundays ago, the story of Joseph. If we look at his story, he was a favored son, coat of many colors, had dreams of being great, and then it was plotted to kill him. He ended up getting sold into slavery. But then he kind of started to rise up again, and then got thrown in prison. And the end of it all ended up being great and had many possessions, actually. And we might look at that and say, you know, things kind of really worked out for Joseph then. It's not that they just happened to work out. It's that God aligned all those things to get him where He wanted to put him at. And just before the birth of Jesus, Caesar Augustus sent out an order for a census to be taken, assumably to assure that everybody was paying their taxes to the government, probably thinking this is his own idea. That's something governments like to do, right? They're going to make sure the taxes are getting paid one way or another. They're going to get them from you. I'd like to circle back to the opening verse there, Luke chapter 2, verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. The reality of the situation was the decree that he put out there for the census wasn't his, it was God's, to make everything line up to happen what needed to happen, right? So God used Caesar to bring what He wanted. So God needed to get Joseph and Mary into Bethlehem for His son to come into the world now. And He had to get him there because of a prophet named Micah had already announced this in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. So now that Joseph and Mary are in Bethlehem, everything is set now. It's ready to happen. Now Jesus can finally come into the world, the Savior who saved all of us. Thank goodness. And we see this, Luke's description of this in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in clothes and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. Kind of like that last song we just heard, right? Jesus didn't come into some fancy palace or anything wrapped in fancy robes and put on display. He came into the world in a manger. And I think that really sets the stage for how He came in. He didn't come in to be served, He came in to serve, rather, and set the tone for us of humbleness, I believe. So now that the birth has taken place, they stayed in Bethlehem for another 40 days before leaving and heading to Jerusalem. They had to stay in Bethlehem for an extra 40 days due to the law, they said, that they needed to dedicate them to the Lord at the temple in Jerusalem. So right after the birth, Mary would need to finish her time of purification before she go into the temple. So at this time, they were still under the law. We're not today, but at this time they were. So she had to finish her time of purification so she could be ceremonially clean to bring him to the temple to be able to dedicate him. And we see this in Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 24. When the time came for purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord and offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. So we understand that they waited in Bethlehem before leaving for Jerusalem. But why did they have to wait that long? And we can see how long her days of purification were if we flip back to the Old Testament in the book of Leviticus. And Moses wrote about it in chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, a woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over." So you see, the law is still in place at that time. So if we want to see how long they were in Bethlehem before they left from Jerusalem, right? Now I had to use a calculator for this, but you could probably do it in your head. So we had 7 days, and on the 8th day, the baby was circumcised, and they had to wait another 33 days after the 7 before they could leave, and Mary could actually be ceremonially clean to get into the temple. Right? That leaves you at 40 days. So we know they stayed in Bethlehem for 40 days before going over there. To circle back to the verses above, right, Luke chapter 2, verse 22. When the time came for purification rites required by law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Right? And we're not sure exactly how long they spent there, but we know after some time in Jerusalem, they headed back home to Nazareth. We see in Luke chapter 2, verse 39. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. When Joseph and Mary, along with a newborn child, returned home, Jesus would have been about 6 weeks old at that point. And I can't help but think that during the time, too, when they first headed to Jerusalem, you know, it's probably Mary's getting about that time where it's ready to happen. They're probably hoping, let's get this over with and get back home, you know. I know I would have, and that's the way my luck would have worked. But God worked it out because that's the way it was supposed to happen. Right, so after around 2 years after Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, they returned to Nazareth, a band of Eastern Magi showed up to worship him, holding the belief that he was the King of the Jews. In Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. So after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." So they stopped by there, and King Herod had a private meeting with him and called him in and asked him some questions about this, about the exact time they saw the star that they were following, and them to report back whenever they found the exact location of this newborn King of the Jews, under the lie that he could come and worship him. And we know that that was a lie. He was threatened by this new King of the Jews that was coming along, and he wanted to get rid of him. And we see this conversation that Matthew wrote in chapter 2, verse 7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." Right? We know that's a lie. He didn't want to worship him. He was worried about him. Rightfully so. So when the Magi arrived at Nazareth and they found this newborn King of the Jews, they found Jesus and they worshiped him. We see this happen in Matthew chapter 2, verse 11. On the coming unto the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The Magi had also had a dream that told them not to return to Herod and report the location of Jesus. Right, so God spoke to him through a dream, telling him not to go back because he knew Herod's true intentions. But even if he was still there, the devil can only touch what God allows him to touch. So even if he was still there, it wouldn't have mattered. We see in Matthew chapter 2, verse 12 here. Been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So being warned not to return, the Magi did just that. But then Herod had realized that he had been outsmarted and that they weren't coming back. So what he did is he used the information of the Magi had given him earlier about where they were going and how long this star had appeared to kind of get an estimate of how old he was so they could go and kill all the boys. Right? And he did that. And he gave the command to slaughter all the boys who were 2 years old and under. The good thing, though, is that he wasn't there. But like I said earlier, the devil can only touch what God allows. But God had worked out in that circumstance to move him away from there, back to home before this had occurred. We see this in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. When Herod realized that they had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. So the fact that Herod had sent a killing of all the boys that were 2 years old and younger probably gives us a little bit of information about that conversation between Herod and the Magi about the time frame that the star had appeared, to give us a better guess on the age that Jesus was at this time when the Magi were there and worshipped him, which is where we get the nativity scene from. So he sent out an order to kill all boys in Bethlehem and surrounding areas of 2 years old and younger, which tells us that at this time he was probably about 2 years old. He was no longer an infant anymore, but rather he was a really young child. And we can see some more supporting verses for this in Luke and Matthew's account of the birth. So Luke's account gives a little bit more detailed account of from the birth and then shortly coming after, and his dedication in Jerusalem and what had to happen for Mary to go there. Matthew's account isn't quite as descriptive. It kind of goes from the birth to the Magi are here to worship this newborn King of the Jews. And they use two different words. The word that's used in Luke's gospel is describing of an infant. But if we look at Matthew's, which explains, the word he used in Matthew's was not infant, but to explain a young child, which is the time the Magi had come. I thought it was funny because I was going to tell a joke, everybody to pull up Amazon on their phone, and I know everybody's got it on their phone, but to search up a 2-year-old ceramic baby Jesus, and we're going to start fixing nativity scenes. But as we get closer to Christmas, we talk more and more about Jesus, right? That's what it's all about. We got to be careful not to get away from the reason that we're celebrating Christmas to start with, not to just look at the gifts and the time of fellowship, but rather look into the reason that we even celebrate it to start with. So how he was born of a virgin, right? And where he went after birth, and the devil's attempt to kill him. Obviously unsuccessful, right? We learn more and more about the life and how he came into this world, and why we celebrate Christmas, and hopefully leaving here with a better understanding of why we celebrate it, and kind of turning the Christmas maybe that we're having in our homes more Christ-oriented rather than gift-oriented. It's a very easy thing to fall into. And Paul evidently thought that it was very important to know about Jesus when he wrote Philippians chapter 3, the second part of verse 8 here, which reads, "What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord." Right? The more we begin to know about Jesus, the more we'll serve him. And the more we serve him, the more and more he's going to begin to reveal himself in our lives. And I think I can speak for everybody here that we would like to see him reveal himself more and more in our lives and get to see more and more supernatural interventions. But in order to first do that, there's some things we got to do to get there. First, before we can really start working on that relationship, we have to start it in the first place, which is why we tell the Jesus story every Sunday. In case there's somebody here that maybe hasn't received that gift yet, we can give them the knowledge they need to do so they can start working on that relationship and growing closer and closer to get that relationship really locked down. And we can start seeing it more in our lives. And people will be able to see it outwardly too. You start to see the gifts of the Spirit display. So is anybody here today? Well, we're going to tell you again.